Thank you all for coming to this week's HPL seminar. If you haven't already, please help yourself to cookies and coffee at the back. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce this week's speaker, Dr. Eric Honert. So in 2014, he graduated from Valparaiso University in Indiana with a degree in mechanical engineering. And as part of that work, he studied the contribution of the upper extremity to everyday motions. So he could have answered all those questions I had last week. Just like our speaker last week also, after he graduated with his undergrad, he jumped right into research and went straight into his PhD. He was at Vanderbilt University working with Carl Zellick studying foot and ankle biomechanics. And from the title today, I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that work. When I asked him what his most proud accomplishment was today, he mentioned that it was a paper in 2018 that he published as part of this work, where he was the last author with Carl. And he said what he really enjoyed about that paper was that the math sort of proved and provided more insight into the method that they were using. And as someone who does a lot of computer modeling and occasionally checks to make sure it matches reality, I can kind of, I understand where you're coming from. That's always a good feeling when those two things line up like that, because it doesn't always happen. So he finished that in 2019, and he's been a postdoc here at the HPL working with the NIG group since April, I think he mentioned it was. And he'll be here with us for a while until he gets a job in industry, which is where he says he wants to go. But please don't hold that against him. I'm sure he means well. So with all that said, a couple of fun facts about Eric. He's actually a very accomplished athlete. So he mentioned he had a very long and illustrious tennis career. So he was a Division I tennis player and held the school record for most single wins in a career for about 3 years. He was nominated the Colorado Tennis Player of the Year and won a sportsmanship award from Valparaiso University in athletics. These days, he says he doesn't really get that much of a chance to play tennis, but instead he's turned his efforts to rock climbing, and he tries to get out as much as possible. So hopefully for your next HPL seminar, I'll be able to talk about all your new awards in that field. But with all of that said, let's hear about his talk on ankle and foot biomechanics during human walking. So I'll take it away.
So the ankle, knee, and hip are the major power producers during walking. And examining their power contributions have enabled us to make great devices such as the ones on the screen here. However, if you look at the feet of these devices, they're relatively simple in comparison to the other joints that have been engineered, such as these ankles, knees, and hips. So if we are to create even better devices, for instance, for persons with amputation, we need to really focus on the foot and its power contributions to walking so we can enable persons with amputation to walk even better in the future. So, as was said before, my dissertation work was on examining the role of the foot during walking, and this is kind of divided into two sections here today. One section is devoted to examining how the human ankle and foot are interacting during walking. And so I'll be talking about a multi-articular muscle model here, also examining the rigid foot assumptions in our inverse dynamics modeling, as well as looking at foot soft tissue as well. And then in the second section here today, I'll be looking at different properties of the foot, such as toe joint stiffness and shape, as well as toe length and toe joint axis angle. So the first paper I worked on with Carl Zellick, the objective here was to determine if multi-articular muscle tendon units, or MTUs, confound ankle kinetics during push-off. And these multi-articular muscles are these muscles here that span multiple joints. And so we were interested in these muscles because we saw this foot dissipation during ankle push-off. So what this foot power curve here is essentially a lump sum power estimate of everything that's going on in the foot. And it seems to be dissipating during the same time as this beneficial ankle push-off. So our first thought was, well, could it be that these multi-articular muscles are actually performing negative work about one joint and positive work at another joint, and it's just getting lost in our estimates. So we explored that. So as I said or alluded to before, one of the assumptions built into our inverse dynamics methods is that we only have, or in these models, we only have monoarticular muscles, or muscles that actuate about one joint. So in the human body, if we would only have monoarticular muscles, this net ankle power that we observe from motion capture and from our inverse dynamics would perfectly reflect the net muscle tendon unit power that's going on underneath the skin. Now let's take a little quick thought experiment here and say, what happens if you'd only have multi-articular muscles, or muscles that go about multiple joints at a time? You could theoretically have positive power at one joint, such as at the ankle, and offsetting power at the metatarsophalangeal joint at the same time as well. So theoretically, you could have a net zero muscle tendon unit power, but our inverse dynamics estimates would still be saying that we'd have a positive ankle power. Now, in reality, we have both these mono and multi-articular muscles within our body, and so we could be slightly misestimating this ankle power during walking. So in order to get to these contributions of the multi-articular muscles, we create a musculoskeletal model where we measured plantar flexing muscle tendon units. We measured 5 of these, the EMG of them, or electromyography, and we put them through an EMG to force mapping algorithm. We then combined that with motion capture estimates and inverse dynamics to get out this muscle tendon unit power from each of the muscle tendon units that we measured with EMG. Now this is similar to a model that was created by Ferris and Sawicki in 2012, but our model here now integrates this plantar flexing muscles EMG. So first of all, in order to validate our model, we compared it to that inverse dynamics, and we forced our model to have the same monoarticular assumption. And as you can see here, we had an R-squared value of 0.98 for our model, which is pretty good. It was similar to a model that was published in 2011 by Kirschway. Now with this model, we can now look at how those multi-articular muscles affect this estimate. And they didn't do too much, unfortunately. So now if we enforce this mono and multi-articular model on our model, we see that it actually affects our ankle kinetic estimate by about 2%. So in the end, it didn't go the way that we wanted. But out of this work, we created a new musculoskeletal model that could account for both mono and multi-articular musculatures. And even though when we applied it to the ankle, it only affected the estimate by about 2%, this model can be applied to other joints, such as the knee and the hip, in the future that have larger multi-articular muscles, such as the rectus femoris or biceps femoris. So again, this was some work that I had published with Carl back in 2016. So we just looked at these multi-articular muscles here, and we saw that they didn't really make that much of a difference in terms of this foot dissipation during this beneficial ankle push-off. So the second thing that we started really looking at is this rigid body assumption of the entire foot. So the objective here was to quantify the effect of the rigid foot assumption during, to ankle and foot kinetics during walking. Now this assumption has been around for pretty much since biomechanics was born, or when we first started looking at motion capture. So this was some studies by Fisher and Braun, and also Elfman in 1939, both of which who used this rigid entire foot assumption. So this rigid foot assumption, basically we take this human foot and we just plop on a model that says, oh, this entire thing is a rigid body. However, the human foot is not really all that rigid. So it deform, so the heel pad deforms right there. Each time you take a step, the longitudinal arch extends about 15 degrees. So human feet really aren't that rigid as this model is dictating. So we need to rethink that rigid body assumption, and actually instead of using an entire rigid body foot, we just look at a rigid body heel in comparison to the rigid body shank as well. So this is a more physiologically correct model as it accounts for how the tricepsuriae, which are the main power producers, are attaching to the foot. They're just attaching to the rear foot. They're not attaching to the entire foot. So this is what multi-segment foot model people are doing in their research anyways, but is not widely accepted in biomechanics literature right now. So if we look at the difference between just these two models, we see that this rigid foot assumption here, this common inverse dynamics assumption, overestimates a more physiologically correct model where we look at tracking between the shank and the rear foot. And that's about 77%. That's a large misestimation. So in terms of prostheses, if we're trying to program a prosthesis with this red curve, we're way overpowering the prosthesis. Now, the new and cool thing that we learned out of here was that this is the distal foot power that I showed before. But if we update this model and just track the rear foot with respect to the ground and let the entire foot articulate, such as the longitudinal arch and the metatarsophalangeal joint, we actually see that there's energy storage and return coming from the foot. Now this is more similar to what we think is going on in the foot, that the longitudinal arch should be storing and returning energy during walking.
Can you super briefly explain again how you calculate foot power? What it is?
So the foot power in this case is essentially the contributions of all the structures in the foot. So both the soft tissues and all of the joints in the foot as well. So it's a
rate of change of kinetic energy of the foot. Is that a good estimate?
It's a lump sum of everything in the foot.
I would say that's the rate of change of kinetic energy, something, and potential energy probably.
Well, there's little potential energy.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So the contributions of this work that Carl and I published in 2018 were that this rigid body assumption can overestimate ankle power by about 77%. And we also provided a framework here for implementing the ankle and foot kinetic estimates that I've shown for gait analysis studies. So now that we can understand what these foot power estimates are really doing, we can then go on to different structures in the foot, such as the soft tissues of the foot. So our objective here was to quantify the amount of soft tissue absorption from in the foot versus the rest of the body after foot contact here. So within your body, you have a lot of different soft tissues that can absorb energy, such as your intervertebral discs in your spine, also wobbling tissues in your viscera or your thighs, as shown here in this video. Also, your heel pad is a really good dissipator as well. And then most of us, except bags, like to walk around in shoes, and so shoes can also dissipate energy too. And studies have shown that after foot contact, that the body performs negative work, and about 60% of this work is due to soft tissue. So this is some work that Carl and Art did back in 2010. So in order to quantify some of these soft tissues, I need to use a method that Carl and Art pioneered in 2010 called an energy accounting analysis that looks at the power sources of the body and then how the body, the energy state of the body as well. So in order, the first side of the equation that I'm going to talk about is measuring the individual power sources that we can quantify from inverse dynamics. So this is such as joint powers, such as the ankle, knee, and hip here from the leading limb or the colliding limb with the ground, or the trailing limb, which is the limb that's pushing off at the same time. Also, we integrated in the upper arms, such as the wrists, elbows, and shoulders, which are relatively less than the lower limbs. Also, we can quantify how the foot is interacting with the ground, that dissipation that's going on in the foot. And that's this distal foot power. And that's this estimate here. And so we're really interested on this leading lower limb here and how that is absorbing energy. Now, on the other side of the equation, we want to measure the whole body power. Excuse me. And we first look at the center of mass power here, which is essentially if you would squeeze down your entire mass into a point mass, and that point mass would move along with your ground reaction forces and your velocity. Now, that doesn't account for everything. We also need to examine how those limbs are moving relative to your center of mass. So we need to incorporate this peripheral power, or this power from the inertial terms. So on both sides of the equation here, we now sum them. So we have the total power now on the left, and the joint plus foot power on the right. And when we overlay them, we see that there's this slight misestimation. And we deem that as misestimation to these rest of body soft tissues, which is ROB. Now, if we compare that to the soft tissue power, we see that at this speed, that the foot soft tissue power, which was measured by that distal foot power before, and this is essentially what's coming from your shoe crepe, and also your heel pad, we see that the foot is dissipating more than the rest of your body, so these other jiggly bits in your body. Now, just to summarize this, I'm going to look at the area underneath this curve here. So just at this is a fairly slow walking speed, but at 0.8 meters per second of walking, we see that the foot is absorbing about 2.2 joules. The rest of the body is a little less than that and gives us a total of 3.2 joules. And so then when we increase speed, we see that there is an increase in the amount of absorption performed by the foot, the rest of the body in total. But then if we compare this to the joint work that's going on at the same time from the ankle, knee, and hip, we see that this soft tissue work is not negligible in comparison to this joint work that's going on at the same time. So at slow speeds, like at 0.8 meters per second, we see that the soft tissue work is about 150% of the joint work. Now at faster speeds, it's a little less, but still not negligible. So if we are to integrate more physiologically correct parameters into our prostheses, we also need to look at this dissipation that's coming from the soft tissues of our body. So the contributions of this work that I published earlier this year was that it was the first study to quantify the amount of soft tissue absorption performed by the foot versus the rest of the body. And also the foot and the shoe combined had a greater contribution than the other soft tissues of the body. And as I said, the soft tissues performed in total 50 to 150% of the work by the other lower limb joints. My second section today is on the biomechanical investigations of a prosthetic ankle and foot. So the objective here of these next two papers that I worked on was to systematically characterize the biomechanical effects of different toe joint properties to walking. And so from various different sources in literature, we see that the toe joint can impact performance, such as in dynamic or passive dynamic walking models where you can decrease collisions with integrating a toe joint. Foot prostheses can decrease energy cost for persons with amputation. And also in robotic feet, we see decreased joint torques. as well. However, we just don't know exactly what parameters affect walking. So in order to study this, we had able-bodied persons, such as most of us in the room here, walk on simulator boots. So these simulator boots are essentially just air cast boots, and then we put a prosthesis below them. And this enables us to systematically test different properties. Now, we could have performed such a study with persons with transtibial amputation. However, there are a lot of amputation-specific comorbidities that would affect our results, such as residual limb length, residual limb pain. And so we wanted to have as homogeneous of a patient population as possible. So there are a lot of different toe joint parameters that we could look at. So stiffness has been examined, toe joint stiffness has been examined in walking models and in several prostheses, toe shape, length, or even axis of rotation, but none of these parameters have been previously characterized during human walking. So my first paper here was looking at the effects of toe joint stiffness, which we could systematically change through this prosthesis that I made through this cantilever spring. It's kind of hard to see here, but there's a cantilever spring right behind this toe joint. And we can also systematically change different toe shapes as well. So this toe shape would be as if you were looking down exactly on your own toe. And as I said, we did this with 10 able-bodied subjects, and they walked on an instrument and a treadmill. This wasn't her first time walking on this prosthesis. She walked about an hour before on this prosthesis just to get acclimated. So as just a summary metric today, we're going to go back to this center of mass power, and specifically, we're interested in this push-off phase of gait. So persons with transtibial amputation tend to have a reduced amount of push-off. So increasing that push-off could be metabolically beneficial to them. And if we look at a variety of different toe shapes here, we see that there's relatively little difference in the amount of center of mass push-off work. And that was also indicative of the lower limb kinematics and kinetics. Now, if we look at increasing the stiffness, so we looked at increasing ankle joint stiffness and toe joint stiffness, we saw increased center of mass push-off with increasing stiffnesses on both joints. So here we had on ankle joint stiffness, we tested a range of physiologically relevant stiffnesses. And then for the toe joint stiffness, you see that there's a 0 stiffness. We completely removed the toe for that portion. We had an intermediate stiffness range, which is of a range that's physiologically relevant. And then this infinite stiffness, which we completely locked out the toe. So with increasing toe joint stiffness, we saw that there was this increase in center of mass push-off work, which was indicative of the lower limb dynamics, which showed that there was an increased amount of ankle push-off work. So this is similar to a result that Roy and Stefanishin saw in 2003 during running, where they saw an increased amount of ankle push-off work with increasing carbon fiber sole stiffnesses. So the really cool thing that we saw here, though, was that even though that both of these stiffness parameters increase the amount of push-off, we see that only increasing ankle stiffness increased the push-off work by about 20%, whereas increasing toe joint stiffness could increase the amount of push-off work by about 62%. So many researchers in the past have focused on these ankle dynamics in order to change push-off, whereas in the future, we could also focus on these toe joint dynamics as well. So on the opposite limb, at the same time as push-off, is there these detrimental collisions. So as we increase toe joint stiffness, we see that there's relatively little difference in the amount of collision work going on. However, with increasing ankle joint stiffness, we did see a reduction in the amount of center of mass collision work, which is predicted by passive dynamic or by walking models. So the contributions from this paper that I published last year with Carl was this is the first study to systematically evaluate the effects of toe joint stiffness and toe shape to walking. And we saw that toe joint stiffness can have a greater impact than ankle joint stiffness, and toe joint stiffness, not shape, altered human walking. So we just talked about these two parameters. Next, I'm going to talk through how different segment lengths of the foot, as well as the axis of rotation of the toes, affects walking. So again, we did this through this prosthesis that I built. And we can affect the foot arch length, or the length from the heel to the toe joint, as well as the toe length here, and this axis of rotation, whether it's angled in with respect to the ankle joint, or it's parallel, or it's angled out. So first of all, I'm just going to quickly go through this angled condition here. And we see for the center of mass push-off work and center of mass collision work, relatively little difference. And this was again indicative that the lower limb kinematics and kinetics did not really change as well. Though with increasing foot arch length here, we see an increased amount of center of mass push-off work. As well with increasing toe length, we saw little difference with increasing toe length. So these length values are for persons ranging from about 1.6 meters tall to 2.2 meters tall in terms of anthropometric values. So quite a wide range that we tested here. So specifically, I was interested in this increased push-off work with this increased foot arch length. And specifically, I wanted to look at the timing effects that it had. So we can look at, so this is the center of mass curve from the left limb here in the solid line, and the right limb on the, or the opposite limb in the dotted line. I'm interested in this difference in terms of the push-off and collision. And we see with increasing foot arch length here, we see a delay in the amount in the push-off with respect to the collision. So walking models, such as the ones that Art has worked on in the past, have shown that delaying this push-off with respect to collision is detrimental to the cost of walking. Now, as my final summary metric here, also we see that there is little change in the collision with increasing toe length. So again, very interesting that we saw an increase at least in the foot arch length with the center of mass push-off, but didn't affect the collision on the opposite limb. So the contributions of this work that I have currently in review was it was the first study to systematically evaluate the effects of toe and foot arch length, as well as toe joint axis to human walking. And increasing foot arch length increased the push-off, but also influenced timing. And we also saw here that toe joint axis had little effect on walking biomechanics. So to sum up today, throughout my entire dissertation, I was really interested in understanding the foot a lot better. So from our human ankle and foot studies, we see that multi-articular muscles didn't really affect the power contributions from the ankle and foot all that much, but could be very useful for evaluating other joints such as the knee or the hip. Then we also saw that rigid foot assumptions actually make a huge difference in terms of our biomechanical estimates. And then finally, we should never overlook these foot soft tissues as well. And then from the other side, we saw that prosthetic toe joint stiffness had a large effect on our walking biomechanics. And from the toe length and toe joint axis study, we saw that increasing that foot arch could increase our push-off, but also influences our timing. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my funding agencies and collaborators, and thank you.
So thank you very much. I'll open up the floor to questions.
Eric, I might have missed this. How do you calculate the foot soft tissue work? Is it the same as just the work done by the center of mass, the foot minus whatever your calculate inverse dynamics drive power is?
So that foot soft tissue work was the distal foot power, but just during the initial collision phase of gait. Sorry, I didn't explain that better, but thank you. Yes?
Sometimes talked about energy absorption and sometimes energy dissipation in like soft tissue, in terms of soft tissue. So I'm a bit confused. Which one is here the case? Are we talking about the absorption, so like a rebounding, or are we talking about like a?
So that is a good question. I should have just been using one term. So I was. Usually it would be absorption because soft tissues do have some viscoelastic effect. They're mostly dissipative in nature, but they can store and return energy. So I was talking more about the dissipation aspect and not the net.
In your first study, you talked about computing what happens at the empty feet joint. And then in your second study, you talked about things like soft tissues and distal foot power, which seem like they're kind of related ways of measuring similar things. And maybe you talked about it, but do you have a connection between the two? As in, if we see energy absorbed at the MTP joint using rigid body techniques, would you say that that's happening separate from your soft tissue power, or is that sort of being measured a little bit differently in soft tissue power?
So the soft tissue power is, let me repeat the question to make sure that I understand accurately. So you're asking about in terms of the foot, is the soft tissue the same as the energy storage from the multi-articular muscles?
Or related?
Or related. So I would say no. So in that third study, that absorption is only going on during the first phase of gait, so during foot collision. And the energy storage and return from those multi-articular muscles in the foot are coming during late stance or during push-off. So there's no relation in between the two.
Can you just explain a little bit further about the rigid foot assumption versus the rigid calcaneus assumption, or rigid rear foot assumption? So you do a standard inverse dynamics analysis with a rigid foot.
Yes.
And then you do another one where you have just a rigid rear foot. I guess what I'm missing is what you actually do for that. How do you do that?
So good question. The question was about how do we differentiate between the rigid entire foot versus the rigid rear foot, correct?
Yeah.
So it's only about the tracking targets. So basically, we're tracking only motion capture markers on the rear foot in the rear foot model, versus in the whole foot model, people track targets such as the metatarsal phalangeal joint head, or metatarsal heads, or the metatarsals. And so what happens there is when you track the metatarsal heads, the motion of the longitudinal arch when it deforms, let's say 15 degrees during walking, that motion of the longitudinal arch then bleeds into your ankle angle estimate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And then, so when the rear foot is off the ground and you still have, and now your center of pressure is on the forefoot.
Yes.
When you do the inverse dynamics analysis, do you have to then, do you go through the forefoot and then you treat the rear foot, midfoot as another joint? Or are you simply, tell me how that works.
So we're doing the same analysis that we normally do. We just say that basically the foot is on contact with the ground. Okay. And so we have, in that case, we assign the force still to the rear foot. We're not saying anything about the inertia of the forefoot in this case.
Or rotation about the MTP joint or anything like that?
No. So that's what gets lumped into that distal rear foot power that I had shown.
And would it make any difference if you defined a forefoot, a midfoot, and a rear foot, and then kind of worked your way up?
It doesn't make a difference,
It
no.
doesn't.
Besides in terms of those inertial contributions, which are relatively low during walking.
Ian?
As you were talking, I'm just thinking about the implications of your prosthetic studies. So my understanding is that if you increase the length of the arch and have an infinitely stiff toe, which essentially is just another increase in the length of the arch, then you're going to get more power. So if you continue to increase the length of the foot and have it stiff, then you should get more power. But I can't see this going on forever. Like, what happens if you take this to?
So that is a good question. So Art and Peter Adamczyk did something similar. I think early, was it 2006 and 2012 that you guys published those studies? Is that where they looked at basically increasing that foot length? So in this case, when we can store and return energy, basically if you create a really long lever arm, that's great for storing and returning energy. But then you're also starting to get a penalty due to the timing issue. So you can store and return so much energy, but then you're just going to return it later. And so that becomes a metabolic penalty right there as well. The other metabolic penalty that occurs isn't during push-off, but rather you're going to have to pick up that foot during swing. And so that's not all that fun. So for instance, we did a systematic sweep here. So we did like a 5x5 sweep. So subjects said for the longest toe condition, which was 90 millimeters, and the longest foot condition, which was 230 millimeters. So it's a pretty long foot. A lot of subjects said, it was kind of like walking in flippers, was their reaction to it. So it becomes uncomfortable at a point. So yes, center of mass push-off work is really good to go after, but there's also other things that we need to take into account as well.
I had a question about the device that you built. So since it's like a platform, that's actually much taller probably than any shoe a person would wear. Do you know to what extent that influenced the way they walked? And maybe did you consider and reject other ideas like changing a shoe or an exoskeleton type thing to play with their toe stiffness? Or toe parameters?
So we could maybe increase the toe joint stiffness through a shoe, but you can't decrease it. Likewise, you could maybe increase the toe length through a shoe, but you can't really decrease it as well. So the shoe option wasn't really there. We maybe just looked at, we could do this with persons with amputation, but then you also have a lot of comorbidities that are associated. So then you don't really know, are these effects due to maybe residual limb pain, diabetes? There's a lot of confounding factors with that.
Did you compare how they walk with and without the extra boot?
Are they
similar, or are they really different? Or?
So I haven't, but there have been studies that Carl did in the past, basically showed that during stance phase it was relatively similar.
I guess I have two-part question. The foot ankle power that looks like it's all sagittal plane. Is that correct?
So this is not a sagittal plane power, it's a 6 degree of freedom power. So it's 3 rotations and 3 translations summed together.
Cool. And then, well, we can skip the other question I had then. The next question is why, so running prostheses are generally just a blade. It seems to be the most prominent design in use at the moment.
Yes.
Why, that's relatively simple, and yet, the walking prostheses seem to be getting more and more complex. Like, why is there the disconnect between running prostheses and walking prostheses?
So for the running prosthesis, you really only need just like a small surface and essentially a power pogo. Like if you just put an energy storage and return mechanism there, that'd be great for running. But in terms of walking, there's a lot more complex nature that's going on in terms of, at least human walking, there's a lot more articulations that are going on simultaneously. And so that's why I would say that this could be an option and which is also a study going on at Vanderbilt right now that they're in the process of publishing, is on integrating a toe joint for persons with transtibial amputation.
Are you saying that walking is harder to study than running? I have a serious question.
Okay.
So this is more a question for like the dynamic walking type people. So you guys talk a lot about, collision forces, how they're like detrimental, or how they are a significant portion of the metabolic cost of walking. So
Yes.
why don't you guys just try to get rid of those with your prosthetics?
So generally the thought is that persons with amputation have a reduced amount of push-off, which then increases the collision on the opposite limb
Okay.
because it's happening almost simultaneously.
Okay, so by maximizing or by helping with the push-off, you're minimizing,
You're aiming to minimize
reducing the collision force on the
opposite limb. So we're really worried about the collisions on the contralateral limb
Yeah.
because those could be really detrimental not only to metabolic costs, but there could be effects in terms of maybe some joint degeneration on the opposite limb.
Why not keep focusing on what's going on at the toe and how to maximize push-off, but then also do something to the heel that makes it a smoother collision, a smaller collision.
So that's something that we could do in the future with this prosthesis as well. We could systematically test different cushioning properties of that heel too. But we weren't necessarily as worried about collision on that limb versus collision on the contralateral limb, the sound limb.
Like a follow-up question. So if you can make a running prosthetic that doesn't have a toe, and it's very simple, and my understanding is that people run with a relatively similar metabolic cost, does that suggest that the toe is not useful in running? The toe joint provides no benefit to human running.
I would not say that, but
So then why don't the running prosthetics have a toe?
So you don't necessarily see a toe on a lot of the running prostheses, but they're not just flat.
Yeah.
There is some type of a rollover shape in a running prosthesis to mimic the metatarsophalangeal joint flexion during late stance. Would be my counter to your
Do
proposition.
they have as much motion as? I guess there'd be maybe the easy answer is looking at like the new Nike shoe, right? It's pretty rigid. I think it minimizes a lot of the toe motion that occurs, right?
So I don't know how much the Nike Vaporfly mitigates any type of motion in the foot. Sasha is like nodding his head right behind you. But personally, I haven't seen a lot of good studies out there on the new Nike Vaporfly in terms of what it is actually doing inside of the foot. They mostly focus on metabolic cost for one thing. They've made some statements about the dissipation in the foot, but that's based on like some MTS testing essentially. So there hasn't been like really good testing done in order to quantify what's going on in the foot with that new running shoe.
So the Vaporfly, if you're running it, it is very stiff when you try to bend it, so there must be some hard material in there. But it's a very soft shoe if you're running it. In fact, when you stand in it the first time, you feel kind of unstable. It's a very uncomfortable shoe to stand in. And as soon as you run, it feels stable, but it actually doesn't feel very stable when you stand because it's so floppy, it's so soft. So it has a softness, but I think that the longitudinal is actually stiff, it seems, when I'm just having run in it.
So then it probably
Subjectively.
mimics more of a running prosthetic, like these blade prosthetics that are potentially stiffer longitudinally than a natural human foot. The point I'm maybe trying to get at is poking an argument into this that humans evolved to run, and that maybe they evolved to walk instead. You know, walking is the predominant form of locomotion. Maybe it's far more important to be to optimize that form than it is to optimize for running.
Could be.
I'm not sure about softer or harder language for study device, but Oscar Pistorius had much longer stance times for a given amount of speed of running than normal human sprinters have. I'm not quite sure what that means in terms of
Cheaper
stiffness.
to run. If you're spending more time on the ground, you have more time to produce force. Does that make it cheaper?
I'm not exactly sure what it means, but he runs very, very differently. Kinetics is very differently in that sense. But always kind of suggested to me that it was probably relatively soft because it had a longer collapse and then rebound. But I don't know. I've not studied it.
I had a question. When you showed that the stiffness of the ankle joint, as it got stiffer, you got a better push-off, and then, which would mean that as it got stiffer, you got less of a collision. Now, so those collisions you're talking about with the contralateral limb.
Yes.
Is any of that also related to the stiffness of the ankle?
So here we saw that there was a decrease or an increase in center of mass push-off here with increasing ankle joint stiffness.
Yeah.
And then we saw also a decrease in the collision on the opposite limb.
Yeah, and you would associate that with the fact that you had a better push-off.
Yes.
But is any of that due to the fact that you also have a stiffer ankle? Not on the push-off limb, but on the limb that is accepting weight.
So the prostheses were similar on both sides.
I know.
So
it was stiffer on the other side.
But it wasn't stiffer in plantar flexion. It was stiffer only in dorsiflexion. So this prosthesis.
Stiffer only in dorsiflexion.
So this prosthesis here has the same stiffness no matter what in plantar flexion, as defined by this little rubber stopper essentially, and this extension spring. And then we only changed the dorsiflexion stiffness through this spring, this die spring right here.
Okay.
And so on the opposite limb, you're essentially only mashing this guy and extending this guy, no matter what is right here. Does that make sense? This spring is independent is not even engaged during foot contact or during collision.
So since we're talking about stiffness, maybe a chirping bit. The person seemed to walk very funny even after an hour that seemed to walk in these things. There seemed to be way too much up and down movement than what you would expect from a normal walking person.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I wonder if that has to do with the stiffness, because I would like you to tell me when you say ankle stiffness or toe joint stiffness in the human, what do you actually mean by that? And how do you get that?
So this ankle joint stiffness here was defined by a angle moment plot from normal human walking.
And then how do you get from normal human walking, how do you get stiffness of a joint?
So then you basically get out a pseudo stiffness plot from an angle moment plot.
So you do an angle moment plot. So
Yes. So
you kind of know what the joint moment is, and then you see what the deformation is.
exactly.
But that's a resultant joint moment. You don't know if you have a 10-meter moment, whether or not that's 10 Newton meters, or if it's 100 Newton meters and 110, and your actual joint stiffness will be infinitely different depending on that. And therefore, I will not accept that you know what the stiffness is, because the stiffness would be a perturbation that you give. What you have
So-
is an angular, change in two bodies as a function of the resulting point moment. But you know, if I do this or if I do this, you get exactly the same because my movement is exactly the same, my joint moment is the same. However, in one case, I'm doing this very little co-contraction, the stiffness is little, whereas in the other one I have lots of stiffness, I co-contract, and there's very little perturbation. So what you're calling stiffness, I would argue, is actually not stiffness, because the stiffness you would get by a perturbation. And as a resultant moment in a joint, you never really know what the stiffness of the joint is if you don't do a perturbation test.
So I would counter that by saying in EMG studies of walking, we see very little activation by the dorsiflexors during late stance of walking, which we're trying to emulate here. And so because there's that very little, there's probably not that much co-contraction actually going on, because we see that the EMG is relatively small in those dorsiflexion, in the dorsiflexion plane.
The problem, of course, with EMG is that when you have a muscle and it's passive, it's very, very soft. As soon as a muscle is only activated by 2, 3, 4%, it gets infinitely stiffer. You know, the stiffness, when the muscle is slightly activated, doesn't go from very soft and then you have 2% EMG, the stiffness goes up by 2%. But when you activate, as soon as you activate the muscle, the stiffness goes up probably by a factor of 10 or 100.
Point taken. So I think on the other side of this is
But actually the point that I wanted to make is because here you seem to have a controlled, relatively constant stiffness. And I was wondering if people walk so funny and that up and down movement that we saw in the woman, because she cannot really regulate the stiffness at the end of her limb really properly, because it's kind of given by that apparatus. Whereas in reality, I would assume your joint stiffness at the ankle and toe continuously changes as you go through a walking cycle. Would be my hunch.
So it does. The joint stiffness does.
I mean the actual stiffness, not what you're measuring.
Okay.
I don't accept that as stiffness actually. I
So-
don't think that's stiffness in a mechanical sense, you know.
So I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah, just something to think about.
Can I respond
Sure.
real quick though?
Yeah.
So also, when you can look at basically the center of mass trajectory as you're going through stance, right? And with lighter ankle joint stiffness, that center of mass trajectory ended up going more forward and down quicker than with a higher stiffness where you continually just went up. You went up and then you went down. So there was a difference in terms of the center of mass motion with different ankle joint stiffnesses. I just haven't shown it here today.
So let me come back to the toe joint. So it's bad, you know, it takes up energy, it absorbs energy. So why do we have toes?
So let's go to this plot here. So when subjects did walk here, and we put this infinite toe joint stiffness here on most people, they did not like it. So 9 out of 10 subjects that we had here didn't like that infinite toe joint stiffness. And so I think that it could provide a more natural rollover for your foot. Because if you just have basically an infinite lever, eventually that, in this case, that energy is stored and returned, and it, to me, felt like it was just pushing you up. And so,
If I understood you correctly, you said that if you simulated no toe and therefore no stiffness at that joint, that was energetically the best. So
no, it wasn't here.
I wasn't energetic. Oh, is that the one situation?
So this is no toe right here, the 0. So we still had toe joint stiffnesses that were better than the no toe
Also,
condition.
you have a little bit absorption of energy at the toe joint, then overall that's actually energetically beneficial.
Yes.
Okay. I thought you said that the stiffer it was, the more energy you needed.
No, the more energy it returned.
Oh, that's energy
Here.
return.
Yeah, this is center of mass push off here.
Oh, okay. Oh, So what's your energy absorption then as a function at the toe joint, as a function of toe joint stiffness?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can talk to you afterwards for
I
that
just
one.
thought you mentioned that with the toe joint stiffness increasing, that would absorb more energy. I thought that was maybe a misunderstanding.
So the prosthesis in total will store and return more energy with increasing stiffness. So that's the ankle and the toe joint combined.
How do you calculate muscle work?
So for the first study that I had,
Yeah.
the muscle work was from just the inverse dynamics approach, basically calculating the area underneath the power curve.
Of the muscle tendon unit.
Of the specific muscle tendon unit power that we had.
So if a muscle tendon unit elongated, but your muscle actually contracted and your fiber shortened and produced positive work, you would still calculate it as negative work then in your calculation.
Yes.
You think that's a good idea?
I think that we're getting a little bit beyond the scope of the work,
Okay.
but
Fair enough. But why do you think we have toes, you know?
Maybe it's a vestigial organ.
We're gonna lose the little one, right?
Yeah, maybe it's just from our, being arboreal species.
Because I mentioned that before, and I forgot now the name, but about 25 years ago, there was a very famous distance runner in the United States, and he hacked off all his toes in a lawnmower accident, and then ran again, but it was a 1,500-meter runner, and Bob Kennedy, and he came back and he ran equally fast without his toes than with the toes. So at least from that one single example, it appears that you don't really need your toes to run fast.
let me provide you another anecdotal example then. So, uh,
I love non-scientific.
so supermodels used to self-amputate their pinky toe. And then they would go down the walkway and they would fall over. They would just fall over sideways. And so,
That's exactly why I think you have toes.
I said anecdotal.
But I think it's a stability thing. I think it's a great way of controlling your anterior-posterior pressure distribution. And I think once you don't have the toes, that's not as easy anymore.
So without the...
Wait.
I'm glad you're getting.
Wouldn't you guys are thinking about walking, like I'm thinking about climbing trees. What would be better to wrap your foot around to like climb up a tree? I'm thinking I would want toes. So like that's the evolutionary scale. I'm not thinking about supermodels.
Yes.
I'm not a PhD, I'm a student and I don't know anything. But what if we have toes in part for activities that aren't just related to locomotion or climbing, like fighting or something like that, where we're kind of staying in one place but we have to turn a lot and require a lot of stability or need to not be on our heels? I don't know, it's just an idea.
It could be, yes. So that could definitely be a possibility.
Don't worry, most of us who have a PhD don't know anything. Just pretend.
I guess in a similar vein to that, like if you look at a dog has toes, but I'm not sure that they provide much utility to locomotion aside, like their foot generally I think acts as mostly like a rigid lever. I mean, aside from they splay their toes and that one, too bad Lad's not here.
What about on even terrain? You think toes would have a benefit on even terrain? I think they would.
Of course, but then the question is, are we, by putting shoes on, are we limiting that capacity for our foot to deform? I don't know. I mean, I think there certainly seems to be a benefit to having a deformable foot, and it's probably stability, or it's just a result of, changing something is really hard across, even millions of years, right? Unless there's a huge pressure to do it.
So I'll say something on that aspect. So people that have studied changing carbon fiber stiffnesses in the foot in shoes. If you increase that stiffness too much, you actually incur a metabolic penalty. And people, and measuring them through ultrasound, we see that we shift the force velocity curve of the triceps array when you do that. And so this could be an effective moment arm in just normal human walking that allows us to stay in a very good regime of the force velocity curve.
Back on the toe idea. I can think of two things that I don't think I'd be able to do without those. One of them is reach high places. It'd be really hard standing on the metacarpal bone. And the next one is with barefoot running. Do people not avoid heel striking? So maybe they're just not as useful with shoes as they are in their natural state.
Like the non-rigid foot would be, I think the impact would be even larger if you weren't wearing a shoe because you wouldn't heel strike.
I think it's a wrong approach to assume that the human foot has developed for running and walking. Despite the foot we walk, the foot is not a good instrument for walking. And if you would engineer something, you would engineer something probably much better. So I think it's wrong to assume that the foot has developed because this is the optimal solution for walking. It's not. It has developed for climbing and so.
On that note, unless there's any more questions.
Just a comment.
Oh, yes.
The best mountain goats that climb incredible walls don't have toes.
I was gonna ask that. Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
support for that too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Their hooves articulate like Ninja Turtles.
Yeah. So that might be better for climbing.
All the prosthesis on my arcteryx that actually does that. Sorry. Last
No.
one.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that note, I think I will end it there for today. Thank you, everyone. So next week, we'll hear from our own Dr. Jalal Abugara, who will be talking about his recent work. So I'll see you all there.